Good morning to everybody, and thank you so much for joining the webinar today. The Global Reading Network's August webinar series will focus on how math supports reading, and welcome to this part one of this series of webinars. We're so happy that you're able to join us today. My name is Deepa Srikanteya, and I'm the Senior Researcher at the Global Reading Network with the REACH project. And today we have a great panel for us, and I'm going to introduce everybody one by one. Unfortunately, Dr. Linda Platas was not able to join us in person. However, her presentation is pre-recorded, so she will be the first panel member. Dr. Linda Platas' primary area of research is in the United States and internationally, and she focuses on measurement, development in early childhood, teacher education, professional development, and the formation and implementation of early childhood public policy. In the United States, her experience includes developing measures of and designing interventions for early mathematics and language and literacy development. Internationally, she has worked on preschool and early primary grades child assessment and classroom observation instruments, including the early grade mathematics assessment, the EGMA, and measuring early learning quality and outcomes, MELCO instruments. She has served as an expert in international meetings on early mathematics and literacy development, and on many technical and policy advisory groups. She also has extensive experience working directly with young children and their families. Currently, she's working on the development and research in early math education DREAM network on the Teacher Educator Professional Development Project, which supports the development of open source materials for teacher educators, such as professional development providers, to support their teaching in early mathematics. So Linda will be our first speaker. This will be followed by a presentation by Yasmin Satavkhan and Mary Sugru, who are both going to talk about how math and reading are connected and the differences between the two. Dr. Yasmin Satavkhan is a Senior Research Education Analyst in RTI's Teaching and Learning Group in the International Education Division. Dr. Satavkhan has spent the past 18 years in the field of education, beginning as a primary school teacher and charter school administrator, after which she transitioned to the role of a researcher in India, Mexico, and the United States. Her research interests build directly on her experiences as a classroom teacher, in which she focuses on instructional strategies to connect informal and formal mathematics. Her research has explored the mathematical and financial competencies of groups of marginalized children in low-income countries, Mumbai, India, Oaxaca, Mexico, through qualitative and quantitative methods. In her current role at RTI, Dr. Satavkhan provides technical expertise in early childhood through grade 3 mathematics to projects around the world and conducts research on best practices in teaching and learning early math. Welcome, Yasmin. Ms. Mary Sugru is an international technical advisor for the Education Development Center. She has over 18 years of experience in teaching numeracy and literacy at primary and secondary level education. In her current role, Ms. Sugru is considered an expert in early reading instruction, second language instruction, inclusive education pedagogy, and teacher professional development. Ms. Sugru currently provides technical support to projects in Liberia, Rwanda, and Nigeria. She's based in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Mary. And our discussant for the panel today is Dr. Marcia Davidson, who recently joined AIR as a principal consultant and researcher in the Policy and Practice Division in International Education. Before coming to AIR, she held the position as a team lead for the reading team in the E3 Office of Education at USAID. Prior to joining USAID, she was a senior consultant in literacy, where she provided support for and contributed to the design on projects funded by USAID and the World Bank in early literacy in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific. She has designed, implemented, and consulted in the development of reading interventions and early grade reading assessments in multiple languages, developed coaching models, and pre-service professional development modules in teaching children how to read. She has published articles in peer-reviewed journals and designed impact evaluations for reading interventions. Thank you so much, Dr. Davidson, for joining us. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started with Linda Platas' presentation.
Hi, this is Linda Platas, and I'm sorry I can't be with you today. I'm going to be talking about the relationships between early math skills and later achievement, and early math interventions and later achievement. As you can see by the graphic and by the title of this presentation, they're not necessarily the same thing. I'm going to begin by talking about a study that was published in 2007 by Duncan and colleagues. Duncan was very interested in figuring out which early skills were most predictive of later academic success at 3rd and 5th grade. And they used data sets from Canada, the UK, and US, which followed children longitudinally, tens of thousands of children. What they found when they analyzed the data was that kindergarten entry math, represented by the purple bars here, was very predictive of 3rd and 5th grade math, and also pretty predictive of 3rd and 5th grade reading. They found that kindergarten entry reading, represented by the red bars, was somewhat related to 3rd and 5th grade math achievement, quite a bit related to 3rd and 5th grade reading achievement. And that kindergarten entry attention was related to both, but not as strongly as math, and about the same or less strongly related as reading. The big surprise from this study was that kindergarten entry math was just as predictive of 3rd and 5th grade reading as kindergarten entry reading skills were. So they decided that they wanted to look at this phenomenon more deeply. So two of the researchers from that 2007 study decided to look at US data that looked at the effects of persistent problems across early elementary years. And so persistent problems were defined as being in the lowest quartile at ages 6 and 8 and 10, all three of them. And it turned out that if children had problems across those three age spans in math, that they were 13% less likely to graduate from high school and 34% less likely to attend college. In reading, the respective numbers were 8 and 9%, and for antisocial behavior, they were 16% less likely to complete high school and 17% less likely to attend college. Inattention did not have that much effect, but anxiety did. The researchers then wanted to look at what sort of math skills were important in preschool. And so this study looked at the relationships between the end of preschool and 5th grade math skills. And it turned out that counting and cardinality and operations and algebraic thinking were the most important, and geometry and measurement and data were also related to later skills, but that the first two categories were the most important. Other researchers looked at mathematics achievement through age 15 and found that preschool mathematics ability was predictive of that later achievement, even after accounting for early reading, cognitive skills, and family and child characteristics. Researchers have found that math skills grow in importance as children progress through school, and that math skills such as pattern, measurement, and more advanced number become more important over time for measures of school achievement. So while patterns and measurement may not be that important going into kindergarten, they become more important later. There is more to the story. It's not just math and reading and attention that predict later mathematical performance or achievement. There are other factors that affect mathematics. So for instance, there are environmental factors such as placement into gifted and talented programs, children's self-concept of math ability, and researchers also found that math gains were mediated by children's engagement. So just putting children in front of someone who's talking about math is not going to move the needle very much. They actually need to be engaged with the activities. With regard to English language learners and math learning, SES appears to be more salient than home language in explaining the mathematics achievement, and mathematics-related school readiness is a key factor in explaining subsequent achievement differences. And finally, fraction and division knowledge in 5th grade was also very strongly predictors of later mathematics achievement. So far, I've been talking about high resource countries. Do these findings also hold in lower resource countries? Unfortunately, we don't have similar types of data, so we don't have longitudinal studies from multiple countries that can tell us the same thing. But we do know that across developing countries, cognitive skills, including math skills, have powerful effects on earnings, distribution of income, and on economic growth. An example of one of these countries is Bolivia, where formal math skills are associated with an increase in wealth, and also, interestingly, with improved indicators of self-reported stress and child health. So, if we know that math is so predictive of later achievement, not just in math, but in other areas, why don't we try and change children's trajectories? So let's implement math interventions. And so in the 1990s and the 2000s, early math interventions were implemented. And by golly, effect sizes of preschool math interventions in preschool were very large when contrasted with a no treatment control condition. However, as time went by and these children were followed longitudinally, the effects appeared to disappear as time went by. But what's interesting is that we know that preschool interventions do work later. They don't all disappear. And so we know that there's uniformly positive evidence of impact on kindergarten readiness for good programs, and that there's greater improvement found for economically disadvantaged and dual language learners. We know which factors are necessary in successful programs. They need to be well implemented, evidence-based curriculum, coaching for teachers, and orderly but active classrooms. So you don't want children just sitting passively in their seats. You want them to be engaged. We know that there's lifelong effects for high-quality programs. Primarily, we talk about the Abecedarian and the Perry preschool, but there's also evidence coming out of Tulsa, Oklahoma for early childhood programs there. And it's important to sustain learning in elementary school. Individualization and differentiation in instructional content and strategies is very important. You need to pick up where children are. So, can we apply what we know about successful programs and apply that to early math interventions? So when we look across a lot of studies, and not just with very young children, but with older children as well, we find that there are three types of skills that should really be targeted. Those skills that are malleable, fundamental, and those that would not have developed eventually in the absence of an intervention. So those are malleable skills or behaviors or beliefs. That means that they can be changed. There's fundamental skills, of those that upon which later skills are built and that influence positive life outcomes, such as attainment or labor market success. We know that you need high-quality environment subsequent to the completion of the intervention. I spoke about that at the end of the previous slide. And we need successful in-the-door interventions because they equip a child with the right skills or capacities at the right time to avoid imminent risks, such as grade failure or placement in special education classes. And we know those children who have better math skills are less likely to experience grade failure or placement in special education classes. And we also know that the combination of fundamentality and malleability is most apparent in children's early basic literacy and mathematics skills. So we know that it is possible with mathematics skills. So the big message here is that we need to take those tools and those ideas and those concepts that have made preschool interventions work and apply those to early math interventions. And that sort of work is going on now, but we need to do more of it. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, Linda. I know that you weren't able to join us today, but thank you so much for pre-recording this presentation for us. So I'll hand it over to Mary as well as Yasmin.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Yasmin Satapkan, as Deepa said, and together with my colleague Mary from EDC, we're going to be talking about some of the ways that reading and mathematics can be connected and what some of the ways that they're similar and different. We're going to focus on three different areas. First, we're going to talk about what some of the connections between reading and mathematics are that we see, and we're going to also give a little bit of background just on what some of the best practices are in both early reading and in early mathematics. We will then go into two case study examples of projects that have integrated reading and mathematics together and the different ways that they've approached it. And we'll end by talking about what some of the opportunities and challenges are in the area of supporting both content areas. So to start off with, I know not everyone can talk, but just to take a moment to think about an early grade project that you might work on or that you might be familiar with, and to think about, you know, which content areas are supported. Is it just reading? Is it reading and mathematics? Do you support science, social sciences, other content areas? And if there is more than one content area, how do you see these content areas being connected? And if it's only one, what opportunities do you see that you could make connections between these content areas? And just to get our minds thinking about what it could look like if more than one content area is linked. So Mary and I wanted to talk about how we are going to focus on connections during this presentation. So, you know, on the one hand, there's always talk about connecting the areas through the content. So looking at, you know, where opportunities exist for skill development. So there's research on how writing can be integrated into a mathematics classroom, or how reading can be integrated into the mathematics classroom. There's also, you know, research on using math storybooks or math stories in the reading classroom. So there is opportunities for skill development with content. At the same time, you know, both of us wanted to say that reading and math are also each their own subject. So there's research about how, you know, math is really a context in and of itself, and teaching math for the context of mathematics is mathematics, and getting students to really engage in the mathematics is important. So what we're choosing to focus on instead of content is pedagogy. So looking at what are the ways that pedagogy across reading and mathematics is connected. And by pedagogy, we're talking about instructional moves, different styles of teaching, interactions with students, instructional models, those types of things. And, you know, we're really focusing on that because while we know that it's important to have some skill development across the different areas, we also think that an opportunity to support teachers in more than one content area, here reading and mathematics, can really help support that teacher to, you know, develop better practice overall, and seeing the ways that these content areas are linked, not in the domains, not in what you're teaching, but in how you're teaching it. So I'm going to pass it on to Mary.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. When Yasmin and I started our conversation about making connections between literacy and numeracy, we actually took a look back at some of the definitions and how literacy and numeracy have been described over the years. And of course, we know that traditionally we focused on the 3 R's, which was reading, writing, and arithmetic. And these were often regarded as important life skills, but they were separate from each other. And we know that now that our view of numeracy is changing. Maybe our fun fact for the day is that the term numeracy actually was used first in 1959 in the UK, where it was described as the mirror image of literacy. And we can see over these definitions that in the last 60 years that UNESCO normally include compute in their definitions of literacy. What we find is when we go through definitions of literacy, we see that it's the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate, and compute using printed and written materials associated with various contexts. All of these definitions have a common focus. So this was our first connection, that meaning making is the capacity to think about, to handle information, problem solve, understand, and communicate meaning. So therefore, our goal today is also to show you how literacy and numeracy instruction can help children with all of these skills and enable them to become independent lifelong learners. And I hope when I show the literacy framework and best practices, how we can achieve this in early grade reading. Next slide, please. So in our slides today, we're going to look at the 4 key instructional practices that form an effective literacy program. If you look to the left, you'll see the first practice, which is oral language. And then also, we've added some pictures of teachers and students who are participating in these practices. So down at the bottom, we also will include some of the research, because everything we describe today is coming from a strong evidence base. Tried and tested, and we have evidence that it works when applied in classrooms. So the first area of an effective literacy program is oral language. And we know that children have to have an extensive oral vocabulary to learn how to read. The more children interact with spoken and written language, and the more complex the vocabulary, where they're actually able to define or explain word meanings, will actually help them become better readers. And therefore, our teachers also need to be able to instruct pupils in how to converse, question, listen and respond, and promote that oral language development in their classrooms. We would like teachers to also be able to model and use interesting and precise vocabulary. Okay, next slide, please. The next part would be the explicit instruction in key skills. By key skills, we mean phonological awareness, phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency and comprehension, and writing skills also. And we acknowledge that this is a critical component of any effective literacy program. Next slide. We really would like to emphasize, again, making that, stress the importance of meaning making, and to add purposeful reading into any effective literacy program. While we know the key skills are important, we also are very much aware that without practice and without enjoying reading, children will never develop that love of learning and reading. So really what we want to do in our reading programs is give children an opportunity to actually apply their skills. And we describe this as authentic and purposeful reading. The more they read, the better readers and writers children will become. And it also gives them an opportunity to practice their skills inside and outside of school. We hope it helps them to build their academic vocabulary, and also it can help children understand that you can learn other subject areas and other content from the act of reading. Establishing a reading routine is also an important part of an effective literacy program. It includes reading for leisure and helping students improve their oral language, as well as their technical reading and science skills. Next slide. Finally, the fourth effective practice that we have in our reading or in our literacy framework is authentic writing. And authentic writing again means teaching writing for meaning. We believe that reading and writing reinforce each other, and engaging in writing activities helps children understand that writing is a communication tool, and it reinforces the relationship between print and speech. It also helps children to communicate their ideas and to make connections and explore their own thinking. We like to make writing purposeful for children by providing them with multiple opportunities to write. And this process will help children to understand how texts are organized for different purposes. Thanks. Over to you, Yasmin.
Okay, great, thank you. Similar to the early literacy, I'm going to go over some of the best practices that are research-based in early mathematics. The first one, using resources for hands-on learning. So they can be locally available, created, they may not be, but I think what's important here is making sure that not just the teacher, but the children actually have access to the materials that they can touch and hold and manipulate and use. Another important practice is multiple representation. So being able to use varied means to represent number, to represent different mathematical concepts. So, for example, if you have the number 5, being able to represent 5 in different ways with the written numeral, maybe with dots and different arrays and different arrangements, maybe with sticks, with, different types of ways to understand what the number 5 means. Other best practices, use of justification and explanation. So making sure that children can not only tell you what the answer is, but also justify their answer and give you an explanation of why their solution is correct, how they got to their solution. All of that is very important. Understanding developmental progression. So for teachers, it's especially important to understand, how do children develop number? How do children develop operations? How do children develop algebraic thinking? So understanding, what typical sequences look like, what skills build off other skills is very important. A couple more is connecting formal and informal mathematics, so making explicit connections between what children do outside of school, perhaps. So informal mathematics, meaning the mathematics children may use when they go to the market, when they go to run errands for their parents, maybe when they play games and are counting, and connecting that to what we call formal or more school mathematics, which is, linking some of those transactions they might do in the market to a written number sentence or something like that. So making sure that teachers are able to make those connections and help children see the connections between the two. In terms of instruction, there's not one set model for teaching early mathematics. So I think strong instruction has elements of exploration, so you want children to be able to explore numbers and explore different solutions and different ways of doing things. There is a role, as Mary said, also in literacy for explicit instruction and for modeling. So for the teacher to actually be able to say, something very explicit and teach a skill and model a skill. And you want ample time for practice and for repetition. And so hopefully here you're also seeing some of those. We're going to make them more explicit, but you're seeing some of those connections already between pedagogy in early mathematics and early literacy. One thing that's a little bit different is when teaching early grade mathematics, the I do, we do, you do model that is frequently used in early literacy instruction doesn't necessarily work the best, because you do want children to have some exploration and kind of playing around with the mathematics and exploring it on their own before being shown. You don't want to show them how to do something before they've had time to explore it and try to figure it out on their own. So speaking of just that, we're going to just talk briefly about some of the connections. So I'm going to talk about some of the differences, and then Mary will talk about some of the commonalities. So differences, like I was just talking about with the instructional model, where not that the I do, we do, you do gradual release model is the only way to teach early literacy, but it is one of the models that is used very frequently in early reading programs. With math, again, you want something more like elements of exploration, you want some guided learning, you want lots of practice and repetition. Another way that there are some differences between reading and math is just, of course the content is different, but also the way the content is organized, where when you look at reading and writing, you might be able to see them as component skills. So you're teaching, letter sound knowledge, you may be teaching phonological awareness, but there are these component skills that build towards being able to read with fluency. With mathematics, you have very different domains of knowledge. So while there are developmental progressions within the domains, knowing how to add single-digit numbers is not a prerequisite skill for knowing attributes of shapes. They're very different domains of knowledge. So understanding that mathematics is built a little, the way that we approach early mathematics is a little bit different in terms of content. Other things that might be different just from looking at what programs are out there is pacing, or looking at the scope and sequence, or kind of the organization of a curriculum. With reading, you might have a structured instructional approach where you have, different elements of these component skills being taught every day. With mathematics, you're looking at more kind of these integrated skills for longer periods of time. I mean, there are different models, but one of the models that's used most frequently is, say, let's focus on addition for a period of time, or operations, right? You wouldn't want to do addition by itself, but operations and looking at connections between addition and subtraction and all of that, but spending longer periods of time on them with opportunities for children to really delve in. And Mary, I'll hand it to you for the commonalities.
Okay, I think some of this builds on what Linda already presented in the first presentation, but we discussed some of the connections, again, that we found between literacy and numeracy, learning to read, and mathematics. I think when we were having our discussion, we call this like building a teaching bridge from literacy to numeracy. And we like that idea because we felt that teachers could, if they understand these opportunities, they can have more effective practices in their classroom. So we've discussed, I think, in detail some of the cognitive processes. We are aware that language development is important in both the reading classroom and the mathematics classroom, because children need language to express, understand, and to learn mathematics and reading. We also know that executive functions like working memory and attention control are important and can feed into early childhood development programs as well as the early grade reading classroom. Yasmin started to discuss the pedagogical strategies and some of the differences. And we also looked at actually what is the same. We realized that, you know, some learning requires a specific order, so we're always trying to build on something that the children know and try and create a natural order so things are easier to learn for our students. But at the same time realize that not all learning is the same. When we list the pedagogical strategies, we really do want to focus on the process, not just memorization. While we acknowledge that it's practicing things is important, it can also, we also need to remember that there's opportunities for thinking about the practice, asking the children, why did you do it? Why did you get that answer? What do you think is going to happen? To put more emphasis on practicing the comprehension strategies, the problem solving, and the thinking about thinking. Finally, we also acknowledge that students need to spend time and exposure to these activities are really important. In our next slide, we'll be discussing some of the use of the supplementary materials, and we acknowledge that these supplementary materials can be used effectively in both classrooms. So for the purpose of the next section in our presentation, I'm going to refer to a project that EDC was implemented in Rwanda, a USAID-funded program, and it reflects some of the opportunities that exist for development partners and implementers to make some of these connections across programming. So first, I'm going to give some background to the objectives of the program. It was a USAID-funded program. It ran from 2011 to 2017, and the objectives were to improve the quality of reading, mathematics, and English teaching in primary 1 to primary 4, and also improve the amount of instructional materials for Kinder 1 to mathematics and English were two main objectives. Okay. So some of the lessons learned, sorry, Yasmin, next slide, please. So I always say that 5 years is too long to put in a 5-minute presentation. So instead, I'm choosing some of the lessons learned that we learned from L3. I also like to mention and acknowledge that we work very closely with the Ministry of Education in this project, and that Rwanda's national curriculum was the blueprint for all the work that we did in developing the literacy and numeracy materials. So when we analyzed the original curriculum, we found a need to address some gaps. And some of those gaps was the need to emphasize reading as a thinking skill, and similarly mathematics as a thinking skill. We discussed with the ministry the opportunity to include some of these new strategies and into our teacher training, our curriculum development, our pedagogy, and developing the supplementary materials. And we felt that if we could apply our literacy framework and some of the topics that Yasmin has discussed, that we would give the children an opportunity to master the skills of literacy and numeracy in a wider range of contexts. So for that purpose, we planned a scope and sequence for English, Kinyarwanda, and mathematics simultaneously. We developed an integrated language program for Kinyarwanda and English with reading and writing at the center. And we included the key skills that I mentioned earlier, but we also identified the type of tasks students should be able to complete at specific points along the sequence. We paid particular attention to how we could facilitate the transition from English to Kinyarwanda. And that's where we found really great opportunities to integrate language into the mathematics curriculum. So one example that I have is a topic like time. And what we found was that students were learning about time in the mathematics class, they were learning about it in their Kinyarwanda class and their English class. And we planned with each subject area what language we would introduce to talk about time and when was the appropriate time to do so. For mathematics, we saw an ideal opportunity to introduce headline stories. And headline stories had been very successful in a program we had here in the US. And what we wanted was to help introduce children to develop their mathematical language and prepare them to be creative problem solvers with good deductive thinking. Headline stories provide open-ended situations in which a specific mathematical idea is embedded. They had three main purposes: to help the students learn how to solve word problems by understanding how they're built, to describe ideas drawn from mathematics or the physical world, and to help the students learn to derive real word meaning from mathematics situations, and also to understand there was more than one way of reaching a solution to a problem. Finally, the other one that we also really worked with the ministry to move away from was the idea of memorization of facts. For example, building an understanding about what multiplication is and what problems it solves before the memorization of tables, was another example that we applied in this program. Okay, thanks, Yasmin.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. We only have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to run quickly through some of this so we get a chance to discuss some of our opportunities and challenges. I was going to give an example of the Tayari project from Kenya, which is an early childhood project looking at targeting children between the ages of 4 to 6 in Kenya, in about 4 counties in Kenya. This is a Children's Investment Fund Foundation funded project. And we developed materials for 4 different content areas, which was mathematics and language, social skills, and life skills. And what I wanted to talk about quickly was the way we connected the two. So what we tried to look at is what are some of these core strategies across both reading and mathematics and the other content areas that we could emphasize with teachers during the teacher training, during coach support visits, during even when our project staff visited, but just kind of sending consistent messages. So the 2 strategies we decided on were extending conversations, so helping teachers to really have conversations with children that were not just, you know, what is the answer? The child says one answer and then that's the end, but how do you extend the conversation beyond that? And we talked about that during both reading and mathematics and how to use those strategies during both. The other one we talked about was use of materials and really helping teachers across both areas say, how do you organize the different materials you have, whether they are counters, whether you're looking at different types of shapes, whether you're looking at, you know, books or read-alouds or big books, all those different types of materials. How do you organize them? How do you manage them? And while this was more about classroom management, it was a very important part of teachers being comfortable enough to use these materials and be able to give them to their students. I'm going to skip this. This is just from our teacher training manual, and I'm going to move on to our opportunities and challenges and hand it back to Mary.
Okay, thanks. I think, sure. Part of what we discussed was the opportunities. So this slide really is an opportunity. Our key takeaway from our discussions is that there is a real importance of language in all subject areas in the early grade classroom. Really, we expect all teachers, be they mathematics teachers or social studies teachers, to also know the importance of language in their classrooms. A nice phrase we found as we were discussing this was that language unlocks thought, and therefore we encourage mathematics teachers to introduce rich language experiences and vocabulary teaching in the mathematics classroom, and that can be done by talking about mathematics and building vocabulary. It's an ideal context in which teachers and students can discuss what words mean, and children can also develop and reinforce their literacy skills as they're thinking about what the words mean and decide which words are appropriate to describe certain situations. We definitely see a place for literacy strategies in the mathematics classroom. As we mentioned, greater focus on meaning making rather than memorization in the two subject areas. And we see that this is a really important part to be introduced in pre-service education, which we call the pedagogy of language. If teachers need to identify and teach explicit language skills in all subject areas, and they need to know a variety of teaching approaches to do that. We see this as an opportunity for our teachers to plan systematically for oral language and not just have a vague idea of, well, we will talk about this today in class. We would like to see teachers identify what it is that they need to teach and how they propose to go about it. Greater opportunities in classrooms for children to engage in oral tasks, so pair work, group work, conflict resolution, and exposing children to a wider variety of literature and materials should hopefully improve the language situation in classrooms. So following on from our conversation, we'd like people to consider this when they're designing new projects. Think of the connections that we showed you today, and even think of further possibilities and more connections. My example of the scope and sequence is only one small one, and we're sure that there are other examples for projects to consider as we move forward. The design of materials is really another area for consideration. Particularly, we feel working with publishers and curriculum developers, that they would consider the language demands in the textbooks and materials that they are producing, provide a great variety of reading materials to include fact and fiction, and also to take into consideration second language learners or multilingual contexts. So is the content in a mathematics textbook appropriate? Is the language appropriate for a second language learner? I've mentioned already teacher training. I think a good discussion or starting point is what are we instructing teachers? What in-service training are they getting? Do they get the opportunity to discuss and explore the connections like we have today? And how could we integrate that better into our classroom? The same applies for in-classroom support. One discussion that we had was the development of good teacher guides, appropriate teacher guides for teachers that might show them how to engage in language, developing oral language skills, problem-solving skills, and thinking about thinking in their classroom. We also acknowledge that there are opportunities maybe for technology and other materials that could provide in-classroom support. And finally, how can we capture this information? We don't necessarily have an answer for monitoring and evaluation, but we've or a proposed way forward, but we feel it is worthy of discussion about how we can build this into future projects. How can we capture some of the evidence and the impact of some of these connections or proposed interventions? Okay, next slide. Okay. Yes, I think we've mentioned some of this. We acknowledge we're moving away instruction from memorization. And one other key point we discussed was helping our teachers understand to use assessment in the classroom was important. Often in the context that we work on, we know teachers work in large classrooms, possibly up to 80 children in one classroom. How can we support our teachers to assess their students and know how to, if the students are actually reading or if they have just memorized something? Yasmin?
Okay, so I'm going to just go quickly with some of the, I want to leave enough time for Marcia and for some questions. So just very quickly, some ideas about some of the challenges when you're moving from these ideas of what happens in the classroom to the policy. So thinking about government demand, often governments want technical support in early mathematics, especially on projects that maybe focus more on early grade reading. So how to approach that, how to manage that. You know, supplementary materials, we know that there's always limited budgets for materials, and we want children to have books because it's very important to have text to be able to learn how to read. Same time, it's very important to have manipulatives, and while they can be locally sourced, that also puts a burden on the teacher. Sometimes you can't get the right materials for the right type of activity, so that's something to think about. In terms of teacher training and support, you know, we all have faced challenges with limited time to train teachers, and what do you focus on? Do you focus primarily on, you know, reading content? Do you focus on math content? Do you focus on pedagogy across the two and try to link them? How do you approach that? And then, of course, language policy, and Mary, I think, has talked about that well, about how, you know, addressing the issue of language, not just in reading, but also in mathematics. So I'm gonna end there so we have enough time for the next presenter.
Okay,
thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Yasmin and Mary. That was a fantastic presentation. Marcia, we can go ahead and start with you for the discussion role.
Perfect. I really appreciate these presentations, and wish Linda could be here as well. But thank you, Yasmin and Mary. It's been a real delight to get an opportunity to look through and listen to the presentations and begin to think deeply about those connections between math and reading. And I wanted to I know there's not a lot of time in it, that you as participants have, I'm sure, some excellent questions you'd like to have answered. So I just want to sort of summarize a little bit the connection between these two presentations and some thoughts that I had. And I'd love to hear what both Mary and Yasmin have to say about these thoughts. I was looking at Linda's presentation and which early math skills have the greatest impact on later math and reading achievement, and the one that had the greatest effect size was counting and cardinality. And I wondered what that means, in terms of those, sort of unpacking those skills and looking at any similarities with early reading skills. And it occurred to me that learning numerals, or those symbols that are represented by numbers, and the letters that children learn when they're learning to read are certainly very common. And they both include learning the meaning of abstract symbols, and both decoding and sort of cardinality or counting are perhaps more similar than we might realize when we try to look at the link and these sort of somewhat reciprocal impacts on later achievement. So I thought that was quite interesting. I also appreciated her Linda's comments when she talked about the skills that children achieve in preschool are what are, and the sort of the depth and I guess the, which skills they learn are the predictors. It's not that the interventions themselves predict, which suggests that power of learning the early skills in a preschool context, moving into an early grade context, means that there has to be some follow-through. And she talked about building foundational skills and knowledge, having really good professional development and coaching so that the teacher can create both organized and engaging classrooms. That's the same for both early grade reading and early math. So I thought that was really interesting. And I guess that she also talked, and I thought this was interesting, Linda Plattis talked about implementation that must be accompanied by rigorous evaluation of the impact of those, of the instruction. I think that holds true for both reading and math. So she finally talked about that trifecta of targeting math skills, that they have to be malleable skills. They have to be, sometimes we refer to those as alterable variables, skills that you can effect through instruction. And then they need to be fundamental so that they can build later skills essential for positive life outcomes. So I think that those goals and the way she talked about math could be easily applied to early grade reading. I think that those early, sort of the alphabetic principle and cardinality may have a lot of similarities in being those aha kinds of achievements in the early years that have great payoffs in terms of building skills in the later years. But then the other question, what is it that we know about the specific features or best practices in the math, sort of the early preschool curricula that make a big difference? And I think the features of these curricula were discussed in the context of the pedagogy by both Mary and Yasmin, and I thought that pedagogical comparison was interesting. I wanted to suggest that I think if one sort of unpacks I do, we do, you do, it isn't necessarily completely, and I think you implied this as well in your conversation, in your presentation, the exploration, explicit instruction, modeling, extensive practice, and repetition could actually fit, in a sort of an elaborated I do, we do, you do model. And I think that in both cases, the strength of the sort of the modeling piece rather than exploration really depends on the skill that's being taught. For example, if you're teaching children, what the numeral 2 or something, you might need to be using more modeling than when you're exploring counting or other aspects of math. And I'm not a math expert, so I might not be exactly correct in how I'm representing these. But I wonder if the two instructional models that were presented might be more similar than perhaps we might have assumed. The other thing I thought was important to keep in mind, and I think that Yasmin, you brought this up, is that that math has domains of knowledge and reading has component skills. And one of the intriguing things that I have learned over the years is that reading, the one reason that reading fluency as defined as sort of reasonable fluency in words correct per minute, one of the reasons that in certain contexts, under certain conditions, that can be a proxy for reading proficiency is that those component skills do, regardless of the curriculum used, if children have achieved a level of reading proficiency in which they can read easily and with fluency, that is sort of a benchmark, a sort of a marker for reading skills. And we don't see the same thing in math, that they are actually separate domains that have some linkages, but you can't assume if you can count that you can also do fractions. So I thought that was another really important and very interesting part that that was mentioned. So I guess in summary, I just wanted to say that while these math skills, these early math skills predict later reading achievement in really important ways, I think it is also critical to keep in mind that it's the strength of the skills and not any particular short-term intervention that's going to have the lasting impact on later achievement. And that even when short-term interventions their outcomes might fade over time, the skills that children achieve, if we teach the skills well, that's what's going to make the difference for children in later years. And I think that applies to both early math skills and it applies to early reading skills. In many cases, we can see in some of the data that after 2 years of instruction, children still haven't learned all the letters of the alphabet, for example. So they're not going to become proficient readers. So some of these early core fundamental skills that really are dependent upon good instruction need to be taught and taught well, and then they need to be sustained and built upon over time. And I think that's something that both of these presentations provided a lot of suggestions for how we might go forward with doing that. The last thing I wanted to mention is a suggestion for some research, and I think it has to do with what was described in the second presentation. It has to do with learning trajectories that are defined, at least in some of the research by Clements and Sarama, as setting goals for children, building a very evidence-based developmental progression for how children can achieve or reach those goals, and then which instructional activities that will move children along toward the goal through those progressions. I think that applies to both reading and math and is a wonderful way to think about how we design our instruction. I also think that skill grouping children can be a great benefit in both reading and math to move those and target those progressions much more explicitly and effectively when we group children. So those are just some of the ideas. I really appreciated these presentations and look forward to hearing some of the questions from the participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcia, for your discussion points and for your interesting insights on the research and presentations. I wanted to give Yasmin and Mary a couple of minutes to respond to some of the points that you raised, and I'm also going to give them 2 questions. And I apologize, just in interest of time, we'll extend the webinar for about 5 or 6 minutes, but the rest of the questions we'll have the panel members answer offline. And if you have a specific question that you have, we got a question from Nitya about large-scale assessments in India. If you can send us your email address, we'll have the panel members send the responses directly to you. Thank you. So in addition to Marcia's points, Yasmin and Mary, if you could also talk about one question that was asked is, among low-capacity teachers, how did you build their skills and attitudes to allow them to promote exploration, critical thinking skills in their students? And another question is, as teachers have learned in a traditional way to rely more on memorization, do they resist newly developed approaches? How does teacher training adjust for this? So I'll let you both answer these 2 questions.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to write down the questions. I'll try to answer some of them, and as well as some of Marcia's thoughts, and then Mary, I'll let you answer some of them also. I think in terms of, so Marcia, just going back to, I think you had some really good points, and I agree there's a lot of similarities between these early grade interventions and how some of these skills are emphasized and all of that. I think you make a good point about the I do, we do, you do model, and I think it would be an interesting topic to explore further about how some of these ideas might, how this instructional model may look across the different content areas and how it may be manifested in the classroom. I think, for certain features of math, there are times when you are going to be a little bit more explicit and you're going to model and introduce something. Whether that happens, I think the I do, we do, you do model, I see all those components being very important in mathematics. Maybe the order switches often, and maybe for some of the reading skills, the order might switch also, where instead of showing kids how to do something first, you first let them explore with it and then you model it. So maybe it just switches a little bit, which could be like, you know, a you do, we do, I do, or I don't know how it might look, but there might be some ways to work with that model, especially if teachers are already familiar with it and they're already using it, and use similar types of language to support teachers in understanding across these two domains, but move it around a little bit. So I thought that was a really, interesting analogy. I also think that the counting and like the learning the symbols for the number, along with learning the sounds of the letters and the alphabetic principle, is something that, you know, you can see some similarities in, and I think that's an interesting analogy. I think you talked about decoding and cardinality, and I would say I'm not an expert on the decoding side, which I think many of you are, but talking more about cardinality and understanding that a number represents a quantity. It's not just something abstract that you just memorize, but it actually represents this quantity, and that has meaning, and that it can be compared to other numbers and all of that. So I think that's a really interesting, something to be explored further. Deepa, I'm just going to answer one of your questions and maybe let Mary answer the other ones. But in terms of the relying on memorization and facing resistance from teachers, I think that's something very common in both, you know, on all content areas. In a lot of the places we work with, helping teachers to move away from the rote memorization. And I think on the Tayari project I can speak of in Kenya, I think one of the ways is by having these short activities where students are really engaged in using materials, and the teacher is doing less of the talking and letting the students kind of play with the materials and understand concepts behind, you know, addition. So not just saying 2 + 2 is 4, but understanding when you put numbers together, they get bigger, and ideas like that. I think that's helped teachers. So I think they themselves engaging in the mathematics and learning how it works and playing some of these games and being a little bit more playful with the mathematics has actually helped them. You know, I'm not saying that they don't rely on memorization, but I think it's opened their eyes a little bit more to being able to relearn the mathematics in a way that we would want students to learn. Mary, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think Marcia raises a good point about the gradual release model, and maybe it's too simplistic to just look at it as an I do, you do, we do approach. We definitely know about scaffolding, providing scaffolding opportunities for learners and also for the teachers. And I think that answers the second question about do teachers resist change? And in general, I would say no, I don't think they do, but I do think they need scaffolding and opportunities to practice and be able to take a risk, and also need some modeling and coaching as well, similar context to what the students or the children require. We know that many of us, myself included, we have a habit of teaching the way we've been taught. And often when we start working with teachers, we try to build on what they already know. So many teachers have strong content knowledge, but they need support with their pedagogical content knowledge, their instructional strategies, and also a greater understanding about how children learn. And that's something that we ourselves in the education community are still learning. That also reminded me of what Marcia was saying about the connection between decoding and numbers. And yeah, there is evidence there about our brains and how they function, and there's some processes that are similar. So dealing with numbers lexically, and some of the cognitive processes with reading are the same. And then there are also some that are independent from reading. So the more we can study, and the more we can create teaching materials for teachers that are practical and useful in the classroom, I think the less likely we are to encounter resistance from teachers to change.
Great. Thank you so much, Yasmin and Mary. Unfortunately, we have to end the webinar, but I want to thank everybody for joining us today and also thank all the panel members for your interesting presentations and insights on this topic. We will have a blog on this webinar, which will be posted in about a week or so, and we'll respond to the questions that are asked, that have been asked and we weren't able to address in the webinar. And also, we have email addresses for some of the participants who asked their questions, so we will have the panel members respond to you, and we will email the responses to you. But thank you again to all the panel members. I also wanted to remind everyone that this is part of a two-part series. We have another webinar on August 23rd, which will look at more of the local issues in understanding how math supports reading, and we have examples from Kenya and India for that webinar. So we do hope that you can join us on August 23rd as well. Thank you, everybody, for your participation, and thank you again to the panel members. Have a wonderful day or evening, depending upon where you are, and we hope to see you again on August 23rd. Thank you.